Hello, this is Kelsey, and I'm here with Ryan and Nathan, and we're having some conversations with microphones where we're going to try to talk about how to come to the table. Literally, in this case, we're sitting around the kitchen table and having a conversation about today's topic, which is critical thinking, epistemology, which is the quest for truth, and some other things like that. So, we're going to talk a little bit today, hopefully, in order to get to some of those topics, how to meet in the middle and how to bridge some of these gaps with people in today's climate. So, as I said, talking about critical thinking, and Ryan and Nathan, if you guys want to say hello.
Hi. How are you?
Hi. Yeah, glad to be talking with you.
So, we're looking at plato.stanford.edu, and they have a definition of critical thinking that we're going to use to kind of kick off the topic here. They say, what is critical thinking? And they point out there are many definitions. But they say that one could sum up the core concept of it, including three features, by saying that critical thinking is careful, goal-directed thinking. And some of the three features that they list are, it is done for the purpose of making up one's mind about what to believe or do. Number two, the person engaging in the thinking is trying to fulfill standards of adequacy and accuracy appropriate to the thinking. And number three, the thinking fulfills the relevant standards to some threshold level. And I think for me, I think it's interesting when they point out that there are many definitions. I think even for me, if you were to ask me like what critical thinking is, I would have some of my own ideas about what it is, being a process of thinking through things in terms of trying to evaluate some different facets of information or evidence, as we might say, in order to come up with what we say is the truth. And I think it would be interesting too to kind of get into what truth is and kind of how do we get to some of this. I think for this conversation's talking out, maybe some good definition on some of these things is a nice way to start. And so, kick it off there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a very interesting topic to kind of go through critical thinking. The structure of skepticism, I think, is also what it's after. You might approach a fact from someone with a bit of skepticism, and the intention of critical thinking is to allow you to have kind of a mindset of how do you go from that skepticism to belief, or perhaps even to where you can then also accept it as a fact as well. You can't go through life and expect you're going to be able to observe every natural phenomenon, let alone even also understand someone's own background and experiences, because you have a limited amount of time to be able to observe those things yourselves. You have to come to some form of structure to be able to understand someone else's facts. And I think that that's really what we're after here is, especially these days, there are a lot of people that claim things to be facts without really a whole lot of weight behind them. And I think that what we're trying to get back to here is what is that weight, and how do you approach someone that kind of comes with a fervor, perhaps, behind their fact without really a foundation, and how to talk to them about it.
Yeah, Ryan, I think you made some really good points there. I think I'm kind of see this as concentric circles. At an individual level, critical thinking is basically asking, what is your personal test for reality? I mean, is it just your feelings?
Absolutely.
Or what tool are you measuring to see that what you think is actually what's going on, or is there something else going on at play? And then relationally, in terms of a dyad, I think it's a tool, one circle out, it's a tool for conflict resolution. If Kelsey has one personal test for reality and I have another, how do we know which test of reality is more accurate or useful in that situation? And then going one circle out from that, what you were saying, Ryan, it's a bulwark against tribalism. Because if you just, otherwise, if we don't have some tool for measuring what that test for reality is, then we're just descending into warring tribes, and whichever tribe is bigger is the one that wins.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things that I kind of picked up from what you were saying too. Number one is the skepticism, and I think that kind of addresses your inner circle. So when you're looking at it from yourself at an individual level, I think saying to yourself even, what is true? How do I know what is true? And skepticism implies that you are still asking questions, and there's a certain level of humility there, right? You're acknowledging that you don't have all the facts, that you don't know everything, and so that you're on a quest and you're searching and asking questions. And I think that that's important, even if you do feel like in some cases that you might know a topic even pretty well, that you still say, hey, you know, I don't know everything and I need to get there. And then the other thing is that a certain level of agreement, you kind of talk about like the anti-tribalism, and we had kind of talked about this a little bit earlier too, where in terms of community of, you know, in terms of like a scientific community or really any community that is trying to figure out what is true or what is kind of the agreed upon approach to something, you really have to have some sort of meeting ground and common set of whether definitions or facts or evidence. Certainly we've seen a lot of things in more recent times now where, like you say, people will just kind of say things without much merit or much weight, I guess is a way to say it. And even the phrase without evidence has sort of entered into the popular vernacular in a lot of articles and stuff. They're like, oh, this person said this, comma, without evidence, comma. And it's like,
Yeah. Well, and then it gets back to critical thinking of a tool is like what counts as evidence. You know, it's like I strongly believe that this is true, or
Yes.
My neighbor and I strongly believe that it's true. Yeah, I have a firm conviction that it's true, or this site said it's true, or someone else that I trust said it's true, so it must be true.
Well, and I would agree with that, because I think that we've kind of gone away from what would really be considered an authoritarian method of information reception and acceptance. We're not hunter-gatherers anymore. You don't really need to be accepting somebody's truth instantaneously, because it's not a life or death situation. And I think that that's really kind of how critical thinking came about in the first place. I mean, I'm kind of speculating here. Actually, I am speculating. I'll admit that. But critical thinking comes about whenever you have plenty, whenever you have the ability to be introspective and to understand that a fact may not necessarily be just that. And there might be something behind it, some perspective that's actually coloring that fact.
Right.
And I think that one of the things that we're trying to talk about here is that we're starting to see that some people are starting to bring some of those, I found a site here, I have a belief system that says that this is true, and they're kind of trying to go back to this, like, you should just accept this because I believe it, or I found something that validates my thought process. And we still aren't in that archetype of a society anymore. And we have to maintain, I mean, the reason why we want to maintain this is because we want to be able to pursue truth as an objective fact if we can. And it's the pursuit of that is still admirable.
Yeah. I think there was something I just kind of pulled up here, you know, in terms of like what counts as evidence. This is something I had been talking about lately, is the idea of a primary source, which is not certainly the only evidence, but
Right.
I think a lot of people, when I used the term the other day, a primary source, the immediate response I got is, what's that? I'm like, oh, well, again, this is where, you know, starting with some definitions might be a good thing. I mean, this is something that I just assumed from like, okay, well, I was taught in school that this is what that is. I mean, you know, primary source even on this is saying, you know, being present during the experience, event, or time, and consequently being close in time with the data. So that would certainly be a primary source. So somebody in terms of even a court case, who you might call a witness, you know, somebody that actually has some firsthand knowledge, whether it's through a document or an interview, you know, firsthand account and so forth. And Nathan and I a while ago were talking about even the difference between, you know, primary and secondary source, and how even the lines themselves can blur a little bit. So depending on the context, you know, that can even change. And so that's, I think, a good thing to look into when we talk about, you know, evidence and, you know, how some of these things are crafted. Certainly we are in a sort of rat hole with things now where things are parroted so often from one thing to the other. It's really a perpetual game of telephone. And you say, well, how do you know that's true? Oh, well, because I read it on this news site. Well, where did they get their information? Well, they copied it off of another news site. Like, and where did that come from? So.
Yeah, I mean, I primary source, I think it's important to also recognize the time aspect associated with primary sources as well. Like being present in a location, having multiple accounts in the same location is also very important, I think, as a primary source because, again, based off of what we know just from human nature, it's easy to forget things and to generalize them very quickly and to average them out. So as time kind of goes on, you start to miss some of those specifics and you maybe heard it this way. I think that the reason for primary sources is specifically to try to get away from that kind of interpretation and averaging that happens over time. And
yeah, absolutely. Because we're all doing an interpretation or averaging of things that we are being exposed to anyway. And so that's kind of what I've said to people is that we all have our own biases. We all look at things from a subjective standpoint. And I think we were kind of mentioning earlier that no one person knows the objective truth, right? Objectivism comes from, kind of having multiple different people, like you say, multiple different sources looking at things. And so, yeah, again, about this, I kind of even in my head kind of put it in terms of like a court case and use that as a model, right? And so if you look at like a trial and even kind of look at that for the way that you should go about in seeking information, you have multiple witnesses. You don't just get the first person on the stand and like, oh, well, Jack says that he killed him, so it must be true.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that it's all using your court case as as kind of an example. Still, it's good to know like most people will want to find as many perspectives of that perhaps like witnessed event or otherwise as possible.
Yeah.
Because it can make a big difference. Like one person might be seeing one thing, but then 10 other people saw something different altogether. And just being able to parse that and understand that the observation is subjective. To get to an objective fact and to get to an objective just anything that you can consider objective, you have to interpret several subjective sources.
I think this is where the history becomes important. So the first documented resource on critical thinking is apparently Socrates as recorded by Plato. So that's where you get the Socratic Method and Socratic questioning from. There's also a guy, I think his name's Matt Magnabosco. He's on YouTube, and he does a thing called street epistemology, where he asks questions about strongly held beliefs. And he talks about the idea of like faith versus evidence in that courtroom kind of atmosphere. So, for example, if you are trying to met out which personal test for reality is the most effective, it's like, well, if you were in a courtroom, would you rather have X number of faith or X number of evidence? Which one requires more weight or which one's more effective? So, I'll actually demonstrate the Socratic Method now. So why is a primary source better than, say, a secondary source? What makes it better in determining what's true?
Well, I mean, if I'm going to answer that question,
Sure,
we were kind of talking about some of this too with, my eyeballs, being able to readily look at something and discern whether or not I see something is true or not. So if I look outside and I see a tree with green leaves, I say, okay, that tree has green leaves. And to me, from my experience in life, I can trust myself with, that I've learned colors and that I've checked with other people that the colors I see are the same way that they define colors, and the thing that I call a tree is what other people call a tree. And so I use my experience to say, okay, I've kind of checked these things with other people enough to where I feel that I can trust myself and my judgment to be able to say that tree has green leaves. And so if Ryan comes in and asks me like, hey, what color were the leaves on that tree? I say, okay, well, I used my eyeballs directly to say that I saw it, right? Versus if you go and ask Ryan, now he has to say that he's relying on me. And so every step that you get removed, there's introduction of error. And, we kind of talk about this in computing sometimes too. It's a copy of a copy of a copy. I remember even
it's the telephone game,
exactly,
essentially. You kind of, as soon as you start to introduce multiple perspectives or potential for error, translation, error in translation or translation, or even error in interpretation, you are going to result in a lesser result or fact.
Mm-hmm.
I think that with respect to the Socratic method, like the intention is to try to get a clear and consistent expression of something. And I think when we're talking about trying to get to a primary source versus a secondary source, the reason for that is really to understand the human phenomenon of observation. That ultimately observation, as a result, because it's subjective and we're relying on a single person, not only their ability to observe it, but also to be able to communicate it. Some people's communication might not be as effective as others. One person's communication might be better, but their observation skills might be poor.
I think that's a really good point, Ryan, and that's actually where I was going to go in my line of questioning. Because what we know of court trials is that eyewitness testimony, while it's often the most compelling for jurors, is sometimes the least reliable evidence.
Right.
And so what happens when our tests of observation and memory fail us? One specific example that comes to mind, Kelsey and I were watching a magician recently, and throughout the course of the Zoom call, he had switched shirts and no one noticed. And there's other tests like this online where you have a gorilla, you have people passing the basketball, and right in the middle there's a gorilla that walks on and off. And if you have someone who's focused on counting the number of passes, most of the people in the audience will entirely miss the gorilla walking across the screen.
I think we also need to jump in. I pulled this up too because I think, when we introduce this stuff to you, I think it's, good to maybe not assume that anybody even knows what things like the Socratic method are. I mean,
Right.
I've talked about this again, even recently, where I say, oh, okay, this is a kind of method I even use to go to work. And so this from Merriam-Webster, the definition of Socratic method, obviously inquiry and instruction employed by Socrates, hence the name, especially as represented in the dialogues of Plato and consisting of a series of questioning, the object of which is to elicit a clear and consistent expression of something supposed to be implicitly known by all rational beings. I think what I would take away from that definition was just kind of wordy and try to concise that a little bit is more open-ended questioning and searching for consistent thinking. That's the kind of way that I look at Socratic dialogue. And I think one of the interesting things about it too is that it can also be used as a model of persuasion, because obviously, as all of us, as with our own biases, the way that we kind of come at things from asking a line of questioning, if I think about myself as an attorney in this courtroom of life, I'm going to be asking things to somebody in a certain way that says, okay, are you consistent in the way that you report facts to me? And I'm going to be looking for that consistency, and I'm going to be, trying to get to a certain direction or a certain angle. And, the sort of jury of other people in life are going to be able to make up their own minds based on other, facts that come to light. And maybe you as a witness are able to paint a picture that is convincing enough to say, no, actually things are this way. And you may have a bias coming into this that you're trying to paint me into a corner, but I'm going to actually show you why this is that way.
Well, I also like that in this particular example that you pulled up from Merriam-Webster.com is essentially indicating that you're trying to get you're challenging biases with this line of questioning, specifically as it's stated here, trying to elicit a clear and consistent expression of something supposed to be implicitly known by all rational beings. So basically, you are challenging assumptions. You are taking what people think to be true and asking a question or asking a series of questions and using that method to understand, is that assumption really something that you should be believing or that anyone should really be believing?
Exactly.
Because that, I think, is part of the problem.
Yeah, so many things that people think they know that are even in the popular lexicon that are like, not actually true. One of the ones I bring up quite often, I've mentioned this to people quite a bit, is there was the urban myth or legend that Bobby McFerrin, the guy that sung "Don't Worry, Be Happy," that he killed himself. Right. And then one day I realized, like, oh my God, it's a complete urban legend. The guy's still doing concerts. Right. And it's like so many people repeat, and that's how urban legends or urban myths become. It is because nobody ever questions it. Somebody just hears it and they say, oh, well, I heard it from Joe Schmo, so it must be true. And then they go and tell somebody else like it's fact without ever questioning or checking up on it.
Well, and I think that in this too, like one of the things that is garnered from this is getting to the point of like you are challenging assumptions, but you're also like you're able to then recognize logical fallacies, circular reasoning. What is the actual what is somebody's opinion or thoughts actually based on? Circular reasoning being like, if you were to ask somebody, well, why do I believe that? Well, because this person told me that was true. It's like, well, why do you believe that person? Because they told me that they were a truthful person. And this is like, you just eventually get to the point to where you're circling nothing.
Yeah. Well, why is it true? Because it was based on the book of truth. And it's like, well, how do you know the book of truth is true? Because because the book is the holy book of true things.
Right. it's defined as such.
Exactly.
Like I've accepted that.
So, I hope to talk about this more as we continue our conversations too. But one of my favorite sites for logical fallacies is Your Bias Is. And I mean, we've looked at this before with the posters and everything that they have. They've put a lot of these together. And so they have some really great examples for some of these things in terms of circular logic and so forth. So we could look up their example too.
I actually had another question because I'm thinking of that Abraham Lincoln quote. Oh, you're looking this up. So I raised a question about how do we know if a primary source is accurate or reliable in terms of eyewitness testimony. And then the other question that I would propose, based off of what Abraham Lincoln said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Are there times where holding something as self-evident is more beneficial than kind of questioning it? Because I think some people are concerned that, well, if you just kind of do everything from a reductionist standpoint, at what point do you have nothing left to stand on?
Yeah, I can see that too. And I mean, there is a certain, I think, danger in, maybe not danger is the right way of saying it, but there's a certain feudalism or gotta really
futility, maybe
futility. Thank you.
Feudalism is a little bit different. Let's get our Japanese emperors out here.
Exactly. Yes, we have feudalism. Feudalism as critical thought would be really interesting. There, we must have the lords and serfs of critical thought. I will control this, and you as a peasant serf do not think very well, so you're in the lower class.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say that there's a certain feudality. Thank you for saying. They're sort of reduction ad absurdum of just sort of always going into defining everything, and I think that's what some people sort of that I've encountered get very frustrated anytime you try to bring definitions of something into the conversation, because they say, well, why are you trying to define things all the time? Well, because it's important. Because if we can't agree on even a shared definition, then where do you even start the conversation? But obviously you can't have an entire conversation where you're talking about a definition of literally everything.
Yeah.
I think that the going along the Abraham Lincoln quote of something that is self-evident, I think that might in and of itself be a problem in some ways,
Yeah.
because you do kind of, if you come to a conversation believing that it's self-evident, then you basically have already eroded any opinion against it. And,
Right.
I mean, that's not to say that what Abraham Lincoln was talking about with respect to equality and how we should treat other people, especially with respect to race, is a problem. It's more that when you start going down that path, you have to be very, very careful. There's a
Right.
completely different thought process behind I'm saying that people of any color, creed, or background are equivalent, than saying like I found this fact over here and I believe it to be true. And you should respect my opinion as a result. And I think that kind of equivocation is really the problem that we're fighting. You have people that ultimately think that because they have something that they found and that they wholeheartedly have put their entire self-identity behind, that somehow that means that you should respect it. And I think that that's wrong.
Yeah.
It's just not, and maybe wrong is a bit harsh, but it's just they should hold themselves to a higher standard too,
Right.
honestly.
Right.
And that's really what we're trying to get to, is that you want to have a higher standard for what you yourself believe as well. And I think that that's really what we're after. We're not trying to suggest that you need to have a specific set of opinions or facts behind you, but maybe don't just look at any source on the web and say that I believe that because,
Exactly.
and it's been posted 50 different times and,
Right.
Well, if it's on the internet, it must be true.
Yeah, exactly. Cats rule the world.
That's right.
yeah, from catsruletheworld.com. Cats are the greatest pets on the face of the planet.
Exactly.
And anyone who says otherwise is garbage.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think, certainly right and wrong is a sort of a question of morality for sure. But I think even if you look at, right versus wrong, what somebody believes to be right or good or something that we should strive for.
Right.
I think a lot of people I would hope, agree that we should have some sort of model for which we interact with each other and things that are sort of approved, I suppose, in the sort of social lexicon about how we talk with each other. And if you say, well, yeah, I mean, somebody that just comes up and says, well, yeah, I believe something to be true, and so I tie my identity to it. And I think identity is a very important word that we're kind of looking at, a lot these days as well. If you say that I've tied my identity to this so much, and I have sort of taken a fundamentalist approach where I believe it with every core of my being, and so you should therefore respect me. It's like, well, I don't know that that's really a great model of approach in our society, and the idea that it shouldn't even be questioned is something that I really take some umbrage with,
Yeah. Well, I think that honestly the problem is that whenever you do make that leap yourself, you are essentially inviting that leap for others. And the people that you don't necessarily have, what's to stop somebody from having the opinion that's different from you, basically say the exact same thing to you, and then you're basically at an impasse.
Right.
You're no longer talking to each other, you're just screaming at each other and different opinions, and which is part of the reason why we're doing this in the first place.
Exactly.
Is that we see that now, and
Yeah.
we're seeing more and more of it represented not only in our politics but also in our social conversations. People just hold a fact and they say this is true, and then they're no longer interested in actually holding a conversation with somebody that has a different of opinion.
Yeah.
They're just
being challenged.
Yeah, they're just reducing them to and the reductionist, the name calling, and the and really the kind of the authoritative kind of approach that happens in conversations these days too.
Yeah, I wanted to tie a few of these points together because I feel like we've covered a lot of ground just in the last couple of minutes there. I think a lot of times, if we were talking about the exact shade of green on a leaf, you probably wouldn't get a very emotionally charged conversation from that, right? But you notice when things enter the realm of morality or identity, you start to encounter a motivated way of thinking. And that becomes much harder to unpack because there's a certain conclusion or begging the question, which is one of those great philosophy phrases, meaning like you start with a conclusion and then you're just trying to hammer on that conclusion and work back from that. So anyway, my point is, I think there's a way to respect people without necessarily respecting the idea and actually questioning why something should be self-evident or not.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely need to articulate your positions for sure, and I think that there is a certain amount of laziness in sort of conversations today, and I think that's one of the things that you're kind of saying is that things boil down into name calling and other things like that because it's an easy path, because then I don't have to think about articulating my positions. I can just say, well, no, this conversation's not even worth my time. You're an idiot, and I'm just going to walk away. And I certainly have taken it upon myself to say very much so that I'm going to avoid ad hominem attacks, and that's the kind of my number one fallacy to avoid right off the bat. But I think something that you said too, in terms of tying identity to beliefs, I found that it's twofold really, that people are the most defensive when their beliefs are most tied to their identity, but also that if you can have a conversation with somebody in a respectful way about those things, those will be the times that somebody will most appreciate that conversation. Like there have been so many times I've had great conversations with people in the last even couple years where I talk about politics or sort of deep beliefs, and you do it in a respectful way where you actually hear their opinions about something or their viewpoints even, because everybody has a different perspective about, even some of the same things that we're seeing. When you kind of approach that and you ask questions and you're genuinely curious, people walk away with it and like, oh my God, that was a great conversation because I was actually able to talk about something that I strongly believe in. And so if you talk about the shade of green on a tree, you might suppose that wouldn't be an emotional conversation. But think about if you were having that conversation with the guy or girl that makes up the color names for Crayola crayons.
Right.
I guarantee you're probably going to get them to say like, oh no, that is, cerulean green or whatever it is they come up with. They're going to have a specific thing that they're going to be very passionate about making sure that that color is, this name. That's just the way that I kind of picture that, is because it's very much tied to who they are.
Well, I think it's like the basis of like cognitive behavioral therapy as well, like this idea of critical thinking and actually assessing not only your belief about the world, but then also your beliefs about yourself and identity and so forth. And I think the degree to which cognitive behavioral therapy is effective, it's because it's promoting this as an effective tool of how you are assessing reality. So it's like if I think I'm a loser and I can't do it, I don't know for certain that I can't. But if I go around believing that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas if I'm able to critically evaluate what my skills actually are and put them to some kind of test, I can not only reassess my thinking, but I can reassess my skills and change my behavior.
Yeah. Certainly some self-introspection is very much needed, in this kind of process. Again, I just sort of highlight, the idea, starting out the kind of session here talking about critical thinking. And I think, again, I'll just reiterate that I see it very much as a process, and part of that process is sort of doing a diagnostic sometimes, and even questioning, is my process of critical thinking the right process? And it sort of gets into this sort of meta, reduction sometimes. But I think that, every once in a while you have to do that sort of self-check and say like, okay, how am I thinking about this? How do I know that my thinking about this is the right way? And, how do I talk with other people and sort of, be able to mesh and sort of acknowledge that other people have viewpoints and, they're bringing, their viewpoints to the table, and, we're trying to line these up.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who just doesn't buy into the whole critical thinking thing and is just saying, you know what? That sounds really great, but I don't want to sit at home thinking about my thinking all of the time. I'd rather just live on instinct, and that seems to work for me. So, what's the point?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question. I mean, it's some of the stuff that we're talking about because, when you talk about like, why should I do that? Then my question to you is, what's the alternative? What is the alternative to critical thinking? So if I say, well, I shouldn't really have to think about a problem or, be able to use reason, evidence, sort of, a sort of process of thought, and then being able to come to the table and have a certain process that we can agree to on how to come to discernible fact or discernible truth. Then you say, well, what is the alternative? I say that leaf is red, and you say it's blue. And then, Sally over here says it's brown. And then we all just say that it's whatever color that we think it is. And I guess really what you then have is chaos. To me, that is sort of the sort of counter to that, because if you can't first agree on what certain things are, even if it's, agreeing with a basic set of facts or definitions, as we've said, if you can't start at the building block basics, then you can't build up from there. You have no foundation from which to start.
I think that it also depends upon like what you're evaluating though. Like, I mean, obviously, if you're looking at a leaf and you're talking about color, there probably isn't a whole lot of like life in the balance that's happening there necessarily. I mean, maybe you could find something that argues that being able to discern that specific color is going to ultimately result in your survival. And that's, you could go down that argument, certainly. But ultimately, I think that the bigger issue is that we're talking about basically things that ultimately shape other people's lives. And I think that that's kind of the issue that we would have, or that anyone really should have, with just sitting back and kind of letting life just wash over them. And just letting it just kind of, I'm going to respond to this based off of only my experiences so far, and color that particular event based off of that only. You really are kind of, in many ways, just not even taking responsibility for your own life. You're not choosing to live. You're choosing to react. And I think that is, it's a way to live, sure. But just, it's not going to be something that you defined for yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that I think is lost on that particular perspective, is that you really aren't choosing to formulate your own opinion. And that's essentially the danger. Yeah. If you really do want to go down the path of not using tools to analyze things that happen in the world around you, then you are at the mercy of everything that happens.
Yeah. It's basically the idea of like, I go wherever the winds take me, is you're basically acknowledging that you're not trying to do anything to sort of control the outcome in your life. It's just a completely up in the air. So I think that is really a great way to put that. And I think that is an interesting, sort of, kind of take on that. The last sort of thing I wanted to get to is we started out talking about, what is truth, right? And so if we talk about critical thinking, I think one of the things that sort of is the outcome of that is truth. And certainly we can have what is true to us, and then we have to balance that with what is true to other people. And I've heard a lot of people talk about this, the idea of objective truth. And certainly I do think that applies to a certain extent. I don't think that there's always an objective truth, because it is always up for debate and always up for being re-questioned, right? And I think that I've heard some of the people that kind of approach things that way, where they kind of say, well, hold on, we always need to be able to question things. But if we talk about truth, we talk about, critical thinking in order to have this outcome to say, okay, I've gone through this process to say, this is my analyses of how I think about this thing, how I justify it. Then how do you follow the process of, coming together and figuring out what is true?
Yeah, I really like what you're both saying about that, because having that lack of thought or insight not only harms the individual, but it harms things at a societal scale as well. So if there's no common language with which to have an agreed upon reality to determine what's true or what's not, it eliminates any possibility of having a common language between two people who see things differently, in which to resolve those conflicts. Kelsey, Ryan, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I mean, if we're going based off of Socratic Method, I mean, obviously he was killed because of people that didn't really like that he was questioning things. So it's like, I mean, at the end
Galileo
of the day,
too. It takes a while, it seems, to come to something.
I guess we're all heretics now.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess if we're really kind of espousing that, let's just go along with the idea of like, well, we
Actually,
really...
didn't he kill himself?
Well, he was forced to kill himself.
Yeah. Hemlock poisoning.
Yeah, hemlock.
That's right.
Exactly.
The forced apology.
Yes, exactly. Forced apology. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's perfectly teeing us up for next time.
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much. I mean, this has been a really interesting conversation. And we'll talk to you guys later.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.